So as it's kind of been alluded to, much of the work that I've been doing through my academic career, and particularly focused since I've joined the lab here at UMass, has been focused on the impacts of both invasive species and how climate change might be interacting with the management of invasive species now and into the future. And so one of the reasons that I'm particularly interested in both climate change and biological invasions is that biological invasions are the second most costly form of disturbance that we see worldwide and within the United States. And so work that was just published earlier this year looked at the raw damage costs of various forms of natural disasters and biological invasions, and saw biological invasions were second only to storm events in terms of their raw costs, both globally and then also here in the United States. So in the United States, biological invasions cost over $400 billion. And that was the cost between the 1980s and 2019. And in fact, what's possibly more alarming is that the changes in the costs between the 1980s and 99 to more recently, so the 2000s to 2019, has increased at a much higher rate for biological invasions. So we see that that change in costs for the management of those damages is increasing by over 1,500% for biological invasions. And so these are not only causing large amounts of damage and damage costs in the US and globally, but these costs are increasing and will likely continue to increase into the future. And so, as you might expect, there's been a lot of work done looking at the interaction between biological invasions and climate change. And because I'm sure not everybody in the audience spends their days thinking about biological invasions, I want to get us all on the same page when I talk about invasive species or biological invasions. And so for an invasive species to become invasive and establish in a particular region, it has to pass through a variety of different invasion steps. And we often call these invasion steps an invasion pathway. So that starts with the introduction of a new organism into some kind of new area that it doesn't currently or traditionally occur in. That organism then moves through a variety of stages, including establishment, spread, and impact. And once it reaches the end of this invasion process, we often call those species an invasive species. And we know that climate change can impact all stages of this invasion process. And so, for example, we see shifts in the pathways that invasive species can take to invade new areas. So, for example, with climate change, the melting of sea ice is shifting the pathways that shipping containers are taking around the world, and this can facilitate the establishment of new species into new areas. We also see shifts in disturbance regimes that can facilitate the establishment of invasive species. So invasive species thrive on disturbance, and we're seeing those increases in disturbance with climate change, and we're seeing shifts in climate suitability that might make it more easy for new species to establish and spread into new areas. We also see impacts of climate change on the spread of existing species, the species that are already established. So for example, with climate change, we're seeing longer growing seasons. And so this can allow species to complete a much higher number of generations in a single year, allowing populations to reach much larger sizes. And it also can change the competitive landscape. So for example, because the temperatures in the spring are warming up much faster, one of the first plants that we see leaf out, particularly here in the eastern United States, if you go walking in the spring, most of the greenery that you'll see around you are invasive plants, so things like barberry. And so by starting their growing season earlier, they're able to be more competitive and outcompete a lot of our native taxa. And then this also can impact how we control and manage these populations. And then lastly, climate change can affect the impact that invasive species can have across the landscape. So I mentioned that one of the consequences of climate change could be increased invasive species abundance. Often abundance is correlated with impact, and high abundance can also change the dynamics within ecological communities. And so we can kind of plot this path that species might take through this invasion process across time. So and often we demonstrate this using something called an invasion curve. And this curve shows the transition of a species across this invasion pathway over time, shown on the x-axis, and the corresponding costs it generally takes to either manage or prevent that species. And so typically early on in the invasion process, either before a species has been introduced or is established in relatively low numbers, it's much easier to manage those species. It's more cost effective to manage them when those populations are small, compared to when that species has become well established and is spreading and having impacts. And that in those later stages of invasion are much more costly. And so today I want to talk about ways that climate change could be impacting invasive species at two ends of this invasion scale. And we're going to start here at this proactive management of invasive species within climate change. And one of the ways that we can proactively manage species early in this invasion process is to identify high-risk species that could be shifting their ranges with climate change. And so a lot of work has been done to look at which species are likely to be shifting their ranges and where. And so, for example, some colleagues of mine in 2016 looked at this very same question using invasive plant species that are already established in the United States. And so they looked at where those species are occurring on the landscape and where they're likely to occur with climate change. And what they found is that for our northeastern region, there are some places that with climate change could be climatically suitable for up to 100 new invasive plant species. And so these range-shifting species are ones that are not currently occurring on the landscape, but could occur there in the future and should be the focus of ongoing monitoring and management to try to catch them early in that invasion process. And so these are really useful tools, but as you can imagine, trying to monitor for 100 new species that aren't currently on the landscape can be quite challenging. And so what our group was hoping to do is build off the study to try to better prioritize these range shifting taxa, to identify ones that we should be focusing our management efforts on now. And so there's a couple of different ways that we could narrow down this list of range shifting species. And one of those ways is to not just look at where a species could occur on the landscape, but also look at where they reach high abundance. And so one of the reasons we might be interested in abundant populations is that usually they occur in a much smaller geographic range than where a species can simply occur. And so here I'm showing you two examples of invasive plants out west. The yellow areas of these figures are areas where models suggest the species could occur, potentially at low numbers. So I think of this as like a presence-absence across the landscape. Whereas those dark blue areas are areas where these species could not only occur, but also reach high abundance, and thus are likely to have greater impacts. And so you can see that those blue areas are a subset of the yellow areas. And so this is one way we could narrow down that list of range-shifting species. And as I've mentioned a couple of times before, high abundance is often correlated with higher impact. And so if we want to get more bang for our conservation buck, potentially targeting areas that could be suitable for high abundant populations seems like a pretty useful strategy for narrowing down this list of range-shifting taxa. So hopefully I've convinced you that managing species that could become abundant seems like a pretty viable strategy, but this still begs the question, well, which species are going to become abundant with climate change and where? And so this was the question that I was hoping to address with one of the first projects I did as part of my postdoc. And so to do this, we gathered data on abundant populations of invasive plants already established in the United States. And we did this by collating data from 18 different online databases. And when I talk about abundance here, I'm talking about a percent cover metric. And if I say something is high abundant, I mean that plant can reach at least 5% cover in a particular area. And so we did a variety of data cleaning steps and ultimately ended up with 144 candidate plant taxa. So these are taxa that are already established in the United States and also taxa that have an East Coast distribution, because that's where our research was really focused. And so for each of these 144 taxa, we ran a variety of species distribution models. So we used 5 different model algorithms and used 8 different climate variables. And for each species, ran models based on current climatic conditions, and then reran the models based on a future climate scenario of around 2 degrees Celsius warming. And we're expected to hit that 2 degrees C warming around 2100. And so for each of those 144 species, we ended up compiling those output maps to produce a single map per taxa And then we also stacked those maps on top of each other to give an overview of the current hotspots where there's climatically suitable abundance habitat. And so that's what I'm showing you here on the screen. This is all the output for those 144 taxa stacked on top of each other. And so the darker the red colors in these maps, the greater the number of plant species that could sustain abundant populations in these regions based on current climatic conditions. And so what we see is these three general hotspots of abundance habitat currently based on current climate. And those hotspots are the northeast coast of Florida and Georgia. And then we've got around the Great Lakes region and the mid-Atlantic region of the United States. So this is kind of our status quo of what things look like at the moment. And so now we were really interested to see if and how these hotspots of abundance habitat could shift with 2 degrees C of warming. And so now I'm showing you the output for these future hotspots, which again are all those future maps for each species stacked on top of each other. As before, the darker the red color, the greater the number of plant species that could have abundant suitable habitat in the future. And so what we see is that overall, invasive plants are likely shifting their ranges northward, so mostly towards the northeast, followed by the northwest, as they're tracking those suitable climatic conditions as they're also shifting. And you can see that there's quite a high concentration of new invasive species concentrating down here in the southeast corner of Pennsylvania. So in addition to looking at where species might occur in the landscape overall, we can also break down how climate might impact the ranges of species individually and as a group. And so we can see that on average, within a 4 by 4 kilometer area, which was the scale that all of our models were based at, we see that with climate change, an area can expect to gain 4 new invasive plant species. So that means there are on average, 4 plant species that don't currently have habitat that could support abundant populations under current climate, but could have habitat based on our future climate scenario. And so these are new invaders that we should be actively monitoring and managing now, because if they reach those areas, they're likely to be able to establish high abundance. And we'll have to manage those species in addition to taxa that currently can maintain abundant populations and will be able to sustain those populations into the future, regardless of climate change. And so on average, there's 18 species that are likely to maintain current abundance habitat in the regions. And then perhaps what's most interesting is that we also see situations where climate change could have a negative impact on invasive plants. So areas could currently be suitable for abundant populations, but could become unsuitable in the future. And so on average, regions can expect to lose 5 invasive plant species. And so this presents an opportunity for redirecting potential management away from taxa that maybe don't have future abundance habitat in certain regions towards those that will either maintain or gain habitat under climate change. And as I kind of alluded to, there's a lot of variation in how individual species are likely to respond to climate change. And so I'm just showing you 2 examples from those 144 species that we modeled to kind of give you a sense of the range of responses. So on the left, we've got an example of the wine raspberry. This is a plant that is predicted to expand its abundance range with climate change. So here, the blue areas of the graph are areas that are currently suitable for abundant populations, but won't be suitable in the future. Whereas the purple areas will maintain their suitability with climate change, and the red areas aren't currently expected to be suitable for abundant populations, but will likely be suitable in the future. And so you can see that although there's quite a large range contraction to the west of the species range, we see a large swath of area that's either maintained or increases in suitability in the future. So this is a species that we'll likely need to continue monitoring and managing for under future climatic conditions. And so you can contrast that against alligator weed, which is an aquatic pest, invasive plant down south. And you can see that much of its current southern distribution range is expected to become unsuitable with projected climate change. And so although it's showing quite a large range shift, which you can see indicated by this black arrow between the center of its current range and the center of its future range, shown by the star, most of the area that's currently suitable is projected to become unsuitable in the future. And it's these areas where we could be shifting management resources in the future away from managing alligator weed and towards managing other range shifting species that are moving into that landscape. And so I want to return to this question that I posed at the beginning about which species should we prioritize now, and ways that we can leverage the output of species distribution models like I've just shown you to help narrow down those lists of range shifting species. And so one of the ways to do that is to update species watch lists. And so in addition to providing lists that are based on for each individual state as part of our research, we've also made the outputs from these species distribution models available through online tools that are accessible to the general public. And so one of those tools is the EDMAPS tool. It's the EDMAPS Invasive Range Expanders Listing tool, and you can access it on the EDMAPS website. And so this tool was built based off those original occurrence-based models that Jenica Allen and Bethany Bradley created, that one of those very first slides that I showed you. And we have added to this tool to now add the predictions of abundant suitable habitat. And so we've actually modeled 215 species, as we've done a companion West Coast set of models for a West Coast taxa. And so all 215 species that we've modeled have their data uploaded to the EDMAPS website. So you can search under the tools and training or under the distribution maps. And for individual taxa, you'll click on the counties button, and then it'll open this drop-down menu where you can click through a variety of functions. And so one of those is this future abundance habitat. And the darker the green colors, the higher the model agreement that this area is likely to be suitable for abundant populations with climate change. And so the hope is that this is one way that researchers, that managers can identify the regions that they're working in and create targeted lists of species to monitor for in the future. So creating these species watch lists and keeping an eye out and monitoring for species before they arrive is an effective management strategy for managing species early in that invasion process. But as I've demonstrated, often there's a lot of species that are moving across the landscape, in addition to ones that we're already managing at the moment with relatively scarce management resources. And so we've got to have robust strategies to monitor and manage populations once they've moved past those early stages of invasion. So really targeting the management of spread and impact of invasive species. And so there's a couple of different strategies that are typically employed either on their own or together. And the three most common ones are chemical control, which is the use of chemicals like pesticides and herbicides to control populations. Mechanical control, which is the physical removal, think like digging up or cutting of species. And then the third is biological control. And this is what I'm going to be focusing the second half of my talk on. So biological control, very simply put, is when we use one organism that we call a biocontrol agent to control another one that's called a target host. And there is a lot of research that goes into selecting biological control agents, testing them, testing their function before they're released into an ecosystem and used to control pest populations. But in general, for a biocontrol agent to be effective on the landscape, it has to generally pass through and meet three criteria. So it typically has to be able to survive within the same range as whatever host that it's targeting. Next, because this is a long-term management strategy that's often employed across very large geographic areas, biological control agents also typically have to be able to sustain their own populations. So they need to be able to reproduce and survive within that introduced range that overlaps with the target host. And then lastly, as you likely suspect, in order to be a management strategy, biological control agents also have to be efficient at and effective at controlling that target host that they've been introduced to manage. And so while we know that climate change is likely to impact the way that different organisms are functioning in the eco-evolutionary relationships between organisms, we don't yet have a very comprehensive understanding of how climate change is likely to impact biocontrol programs, and especially the relationship between biocontrol agents and their target hosts. That isn't to say that we don't have any idea of how climate change could impact. So there's a lot of research out there that has shown already climate is impacting these 3 core stages of biocontrol programs. So as an example, one of the main limiting factors of many biocontrol agents, particularly insects, is their ability to survive winters. And so with climate change increasing minimum winter temperatures, we're already seeing increased overwintering survival, both of biocontrol agents, but also their target hosts. And these shifts in survival in turn can allow range expansion in one or both of these species. We can also see climate change affecting the reproductive output and reproductive rate of either biocontrol agents and their hosts. So for example, longer growing seasons can also increase the number of generations, either of biocontrol agents or of their target hosts. And we can see shifts in developmental rates. So for example, warmer temperatures are often correlated with faster development. And this might sound good, but it also brings up some challenges associated with the way that biocontrol functions. And this sort of brings us to this third category of how climate change might impact the efficacy or performance of biocontrol agents. And so one of these impacts is the potential loss of synchrony between that biocontrol agent and its host. So for example, if you have an insect that predates the larval form of another insect, then changes in development rate can affect when these 2 organisms are occurring on the landscape and may result in a mismatch in when these organisms are occurring together that could result in a decrease in the efficacy if the host species is developing faster than its biocontrol counterpart. We can also see mismatches in traits. So the feeding rates of biocontrol agents might not track the feeding rates of their hosts. And so this also may impact how effective those agents are at controlling target host populations. And so we can kind of categorize the way that climate change might impact either biocontrol agents or their hosts into 3 broad categories. So we can either see overall climate benefits to how those agents and hosts are responding. Maybe climate change doesn't impact them at all. And then lastly, we might see climate change having a detrimental impact to how those organisms are functioning. So seeing a reduction, a reduced function in one or both of these organisms. But at the moment, we don't have a great understanding of what empirical evidence there is for any of these possible interactions between biocontrol agents and their hosts. So we don't know what we don't know, we don't know what we do know, and we don't know what systems we know information in. And so one of the core questions for this part of my research has been to identify some of these knowledge gaps relating to the impacts of climate change on invasive species management using biological control. And so there were 2 main questions that we were looking to answer as part of this work. So first, we were really looking for the empirical evidence for the impacts of climate change on biological control agents, not looking at things like computer simulations or models, but the actual experimental evidence for climate change impacts. And so I like to think of this as kind of the state of the science underlying how climate change may impact biocontrol efficacy. And then second, I was interested in digging into these impacts a little more closely by more specifically looking at the impacts of temperature on biocontrol performance. So I was really interested in whether biocontrol agents are showing similar responses to their target hosts, and if we can find evidence of any kind of mismatch between those agents and hosts. So to do this, our team conducted a keyword search using keywords associated with biological control and climate change, using the Web of Science search engine. And this resulted in just over 2,000 articles. We then went through and cleaned up those articles, so read through them, excluded ones that didn't experimentally manipulate some kind of environmental variable, and test for an effect in biocontrol agents, so some kind of biocontrol agent response. And when we did this, this resulted in 194 unique studies that looked at that relationship between environmental change and an biocontrol agent. And so I'm going to give you just a quick overview of some of the key results from those 194 papers from the systematic review. So we found that overall, most of these studies have been conducted in some kind of lab or greenhouse setting, so a very controlled environment. Very few of them have looked at multiple different experimental setups. So, for example, mixing lab and field experiments. And this suggests that most of our current understanding of the potential impacts of climate change on biocontrol agents are coming from the lab, and we don't know how closely those lab results likely reflect what we actually see out in the field. And so this is a key research area and research gap that will hopefully be addressed in the future. We also see, if we look across the various different environmental variables that were studied in these papers, then you can see them here on the y-axis, that the majority of these 194 studies manipulate temperature as the key environmental variable that they're testing. And in fact, the majority of studies not only just look at temperature, but they only look at one environmental variable. And so this means that we don't have a great understanding about the impact of some of these other environmental variables that we know are already changing with climate change, for example, carbon dioxide and changes in precipitation. But we also don't really understand how multiple environmental variables are likely to interact with each other to affect the responses of biocontrol agents. And we know that none of these variables are acting in isolation. And so this is another key research gap that we will need to be filled in the future if we're to make more informed decisions about how to employ biocontrol agents for the management of invasive species. We were also interested in the kinds of responses that were being tested in these manipulative studies. And so here on the left, I'm showing you the kinds of data that are being collected in studies in terms of the biocontrol responses. And so that's shown in blue. And then in orange, we've got the responses that are being recorded for the target hosts of these studies. And for the biocontrol agents, around a third of the studies measure something to do with reproduction or development of those biocontrol species. So things like number of eggs laid, reproduction rate, things like that. We also see a large number of studies measuring some form of biocontrol performance. So mostly feeding or parasitism rate. And then lastly, followed by survival. And these three categories quite nicely match those three core stages of biological control that I presented at the beginning. Similarly, for hosts, we see survival and reproduction are among the two most frequently studied traits of target hosts in terms of how climate change is likely to impact them, followed by abundance. But if you cast your eye across the y-axes of both of these graphs, you can see that there is quite a broad diversity of data out there on how climate change could impact biological control, all their target hosts. And then lastly, there's a variety of different settings at which biological control is often employed. And I'm showing you the four most common settings here on the y-axis. And we see that through the systematic review, most of the information that we have out there on how climate change is likely to impact biocontrol systems is gathered for biological control agents that are being employed in an agricultural or farming situation. So these are biocontrol agents that are being used to control agricultural crop pests like spider mites, aphids, and tomato leaf miners. Whereas only about a third of the information that we have out there from our review is based on biocontrol agents that are affecting natural systems, so things like forests, wetlands, rangelands, things like that. And so this represents another key knowledge gap that most of our knowledge is coming from within these agricultural systems. And so focused on very different taxa than what some of us might immediately think of when we're thinking of invasive species and invasive species management. And so that was just a little flavor of some of the data that we've been collecting on the empirical evidence for climate change impacts. And so now I want to shift gears and dig a little deeper into some of the evidence for how temperature specifically is likely to impact biocontrol performance. And we do this by looking at how temperature is likely to impact biocontrol efficacy. And to measure efficacy, we really need to take into account not just how climate change is likely to impact the biocontrol agent itself, but also its target host, because this management technique is really founded on the interaction between these two species. And so to do that, we went back to those 194 papers that we had gleaned that initial information from, and specifically looked for papers that had manipulated temperature as a variable because that's where most of the data is coming from, and tested for a response in both the biocontrol agent and the target host. And we also narrowed down our list even further to just focus on arthropod biocontrol agents because these are both the most frequently used biocontrol agent, and most of the studies that we found were using arthropods as our agents. And so this narrowed down that list of papers from 194 to just 18. And so for these 18 studies, we extracted information on biocontrol responses and paired those responses to target host responses for every single temperature condition that was tested in that study. And we tried to match the responses between the biocontrol agent and their host as closely as possible. So, for example, if our biocontrol agent is a beetle that eats plants or plant material, then the response for the biocontrol agent is likely going to be feeding rate or the amount of plant material eaten, whereas the corresponding target host response is the growth of that plant or the biomass of that plant that's under those environmental conditions. And so when we gathered all this data across all these different studies, we then used a Bayesian mixed effects model to look at how the overall responses of biocontrol agents and target hosts are likely to shift for every degree Celsius change in temperature. And so that's what I'm showing you here. So this figure is showing you the overall output from that Bayesian mixed effects model. And so overall, we found no significant effect of temperature on either the host response or the biocontrol response. And so in this figure, this vertical black line represents no effect of temperature on the responses being measured in these studies. And the means of these responses for either the biocontrol agent, shown in blue, or the target host, shown in orange, are represented by these black dots surrounded by 95% credible intervals. And so overall, it doesn't seem like climate change is having a significant effect in general on biocontrol agents or their target hosts. But if you look at the spread of the data, you see that there is data located both to the left-hand side of this line, which would indicate a negative effect of temperature on responses, as well as to the right of the line, which is a positive effect of temperature on responses. So perhaps unsurprisingly, there's a lot of variation across all these different systems. And so for the sake of time, I'm going to pare all this variation down into just a few slides. And so overall, across those 18 studies, which we extracted this data for, 13 of them showed no overall effect of temperature on either the biocontrol response or the target host. So this kind of suggests that at least in these systems, temperature is unlikely to shift the interaction between these species from where it currently stands. We find 2 studies of the 18 where temperature doesn't appear to impact the performance of the biocontrol agent, but does appear to reduce the performance in the target host. And so in these studies, this might suggest that temperature changes of climate change could benefit the efficacy of biological control in these particular systems. We also find evidence for the reverse of this, where temperature reduces the efficacy of biological control while not affecting the performance of the target host overall. And so in these situations, the host appears like it will stand to benefit from potential temperature shifts with climate change. One of those 18 studies, we see no change in biocontrol and a benefit for the host, in which case, again, is another host benefit situation. And one study also that shows a reduction in both the performance of biocontrol agents and a reduction in the target host. But the effect of temperature on the biocontrol agent is much greater in the negative direction. So it's a stronger detrimental effect, as you can see in this figure, where this mean response of our biocontrol agent, shown in blue, is further to the left than our invasive species, which in this case is the emerald ash borer, shown in orange. And so this is why it's so important to look at how both the agent and the host are likely to be responding. Because if we just looked at emerald ash borer, we might conclude that climate change is going to be benefiting the management of the species. But if we're looking at both of them together, this shows that biocontrol efficacy is likely to be reduced in this particular system, at least just based on these shifts associated with temperature. And perhaps encouragingly, we didn't find evidence for our worst case scenario. So a worst case scenario would be where climate change reduces the performance of that biological control agent, but benefits the response of that host, so benefits host performance. And so if we just focus on the performance of biological control in terms of feeding or parasitism efficiency, we don't see this scenario happening. And so this is maybe a bit of a silver lining, or some positive food for thought as we're thinking about potential impacts that climate change might have on management using this strategy. And so I just want to close out this talk by highlighting a couple of case studies to both emphasize some of the potential impacts of climate change on biocontrol and the intricacies of trying to tease apart these relationships. And so the first one is one that I have mentioned, I think, previously, looking at how climate change might benefit biocontrol. And so in this system, we're looking at the impact of warming on alligator weed flea beetles, which are our biocontrol agent shown here. This is a biocontrol beetle that feeds on the leaves and stems of alligator weed, which is a noxious aquatic plant found in the southeastern United States. And so in this study by Liu et al. In 2013, they tested survival of both this biocontrol agent and host under warming conditions and found that survival in both the host and the agent increased with warmer climatic conditions, suggesting that both of these species could potentially expand their ranges into warmer regions with climate change. But the study also looked at the performance of these two organisms under these warming conditions. And what they found is that while survival in the target host was higher with warming, that was the only benefit to the plant. There was no other shifts in plant performance in terms of things like biomass and things like that. Whereas for the beetle, increased overwintering survival allowed the beetle to reach much higher overall abundance and enhance the herbivory effects of these beetles, which in turn resulted in greater death of the target host under warming conditions. And so this suggests that where the beetle and host co-occur, climate change is likely to magnify the impacts that this biocontrol agent is having in managing alligator weed, which is really encouraging. And then the last case study that I want to share is one where I want to illustrate why it's so important to look at not just one component of this relationship. And so here I'm showing you an example where there are predatory mites that you can commercially buy as a biocontrol agent to manage spider mites, which eat over 1,000 different plant species. And so in this study, they looked at the effects of heat waves on both of these two mites and found that for both predatory mites and spider mites, that survival was higher with heat waves, but that survival was sort of skewed and much higher in the predatory mite compared to the spider mite. So survival in terms of heat waves is benefiting our biocontrol agent over our target host. They also looked at how heat waves might impact the reproduction of these two mites. And while they found that reproduction in both of them was faster under heat wave conditions compared to current conditions, they found that those benefits associated with reproduction were much higher in the spider mite. So spider mites have higher egg production and develop faster than their biocontrol counterparts. And there wasn't a trade-off with female body size. So female spider mites could still maintain large body sizes even under heat wave conditions, whereas they didn't see that in the predatory mites. And what was even more interesting and perhaps important to link all of these different measures across within a single system is that although when you dig into how heat waves are likely to impact the performance in terms of feeding rates of these two organisms, although both of these organisms are increasing their feeding rate, so predation rate for the biocontrol mite and foraging rate for the spider mites, what we see is that the predatory mites, it's the females themselves that are much more efficient and eat a lot more eggs of spider mites than the males do. And so because males of the predatory mite are the ones that are deriving the benefits from these heat wave conditions, this could result in a mismatch between when female predatory mites are encountering spider mites. And so the authors of the study ultimately concluded that this could actually be a detriment to biological control using this particular predatory mite in this system. So I'm hoping that, I know that this was a lot of information to digest in a short amount of time, but I'm hoping that this case study illustrates why it can be quite complicated to come up with a concise conclusion of how climate change is likely to impact the efficacy of a particular biological control agent, and why it's so important to look at both that biocontrol agent and its target host. And so I want to conclude with some of the implications that I think are particularly important from this work. So firstly, we need a lot more studies in general on potential climate change impacts to biological control agents, but also more studies that look at both the biocontrol agent and their host simultaneously, since this is a relationship that involves two particular species in order for this management strategy to work. We also need a lot more studies that look at multiple environmental variables, so not just temperature, and also test for responses in biocontrol agents and hosts outside of laboratory settings, so in more field and natural settings, to make sure that those results that we're seeing in the lab are translating into the field. And it's with that information that we can use to be more explicit in how we're incorporating climate change, both into how we're selecting biocontrol agents to be used in the first place, but also the approval process that these biocontrol agents have to go through before they're approved for use. And then lastly, I just want to pitch the fact that it's really important to be building these relationships across researchers and practitioners. So for example, as a researcher, I'm not always aware of what species are most important for management of invasive species in the field. And so, making these connections with practitioners is one way to help identify species to focus future studies on. On the flip side, we really need a lot more data on how biocontrol agents and their hosts are functioning at the moment. So collecting baseline data from field sites. And this is challenging for a lot of practitioners because of time and resource limitations. And so by forming links with researchers, this is one way to both boost personnel and sharing field sites, things like that. One way to help collect this data and get these monitoring programs up and running into the future. And so with that, I have a lot of people to thank. Both of the projects that I've presented to you today have been supported and worked on by a huge number of colleagues and collaborators, and it wouldn't have been possible for either of these things to happen without all the brilliant people that you see listed here on the screen, and also the support of the numerous funding sources, including that from the Northeast CASC network, that's made this research possible. And so a big shout out to them, and hopefully I've got enough time for questions, and feel free to email me.